Thank you for tuning in to the Postmodern Realities podcast, brought to you by the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. I'm Melanie Cogdill, Managing Editor of the Christian Research Journal. It's January 2023, and this is episode 324, which is a conversation that is spoiler-filled about the film in theaters now that is Avatar 2, which is called Avatar, The Way of Water. On this episode, I'm joined by Cole Burgett, who is a graduate of Dallas Theological Seminary and the Moody Bible Institute. Cole writes exclusively about theology and popular culture, and he is also a high school Bible teacher. Cole has written an online exclusive film review article for the Christian Research Journal, and his article is called The Way of Family in Avatar, The Way of Water. And our subscribers can read his article for free at our website, equip.org. Now, if you haven't already subscribed, if you go to equip.org to subscribe, for your subscription, you receive online access to all of our exclusive articles that are just for subscribers at equip.org. Cole, it's good to have you on again.
Always good to be here. Thank you.
Well, some of our subscribers may remember way back in the day when the first Avatar film came out back in 2009, the Christian Research Journal published a cover story about that film. And so, of course, there had been rumblings about sequels, but, it's been more than a decade and just different fits and starts, I think, for director James Cameron of Titanic film fame. And he actually got this new Avatar sequel. Now, I think a lot of people were probably wondering, will anyone care 13 years later? But so far at the worldwide box office since the film was released, it has grossed $1.7 billion. So I think even a new generation of filmgoers, maybe not too familiar with the old one, have embraced this new film, this sequel. And I guess a few more sequels are planned after this one. It was kind of like, if this one's successful, and it sure has been successful as much as the first one. So I also went to see Avatar, The Way of Water, and I didn't even review what it was about, and I probably should have, because the first few, moments of the film, I just was trying to remember what in the world happened to get to this point, and after the film was over, I went and reviewed. But I would like to ask Cole to give us a brief overview of the Avatar films and the concept of the films, and I also want to say this is going to be a spoiler-filled review, so if you haven't seen Avatar, The Way of Water, and you don't like spoilers, come back to this podcast after you've watched it. But Cole, why don't you tell us a little bit more about the background of the films and its overall plot?
Sure. So Avatar is the epitome of what is sometimes called high concept storytelling. A high concept narrative is a story that involves a very interesting but easily communicable premise, usually employed to allow for commentary on a particular subject. So with Avatar, the basic concept is this. In the future, humans develop the ability to transfer consciousness into an artificially created being that is used to explore an alien culture. It's a very interesting premise. It's not something that you see every day, but all the basic ingredients might be familiar to us. And that's the key to a high concept narrative. It's something that takes familiar ingredients, but mixes them into something new and interesting. That is a fascinating hook that makes you wonder about the story. Just from that description alone, there is real storytelling potential to that idea. And the pitch itself makes you sort of lean forward and wonder where the narrative will go. Now, that artificially created being is the titular avatar. And the nuts and bolts of the story involve this young man named Jake Sully, played by Sam Worthington, who is requisitioned to take over his dead brother's avatar. And that avatar has been created to help humans ingratiate themselves to the natives of another planet that humans are now mining for resources. Those natives are called the Na'vi, and these are those very iconic blue people that are all over the promotional material that everybody sort of associates with the film. And just from that setup, you can probably see where the storyline goes. It's a fairly paint-by-the-numbers story in that way. Jake becomes very sympathetic to these Na'vi, and in turn, they come to accept him in his avatar form. He ends up helping them to rebel against the humans, destroying their planet. Again, it's fairly standard stuff. But that becomes the overall premise of the Avatar films. Jake, in his avatar form, ends up helping these natives to wage war against this colonizing force of humanity.
So, what are these natives like? Because Avatar, the first film, takes place in very much of a lush environment, and there seems to be a lot of themes involving nature and kind of like, the noble person that's a tribes person that is full of loving nature and the planet that they're on and that kind of thing, that those kind of themes. So what is kind of the setting of these blue people?
Yeah, the planet that the story takes place on primarily is called Pandora. And it's this planet that the humans have now turned to mine for resources due to the dwindling resources of Earth. And the natives, the Na'vi, are very much modeled after tribal societies here on Earth. They're very closely connected to nature. It's very much a sort of what we might call even a hunter-gatherer type of a culture, primitive culture. And the clash between the primitives and the technologically advanced colonizers becomes the core conflict of these stories. And Jake, in avatar form, as he gets to know the Na'vi, becomes familiar with their culture. He starts to see the things that they value and begins to understand why they value nature in the first place, why they value their particular culture, their community, that sort of thing. So, very, very primitive beings, but a very rich culture is probably the best way to describe the Na'vi.
Well, I think I've been surprised at the huge financial success of this follow-up, more than 13 years later, because a lot of times sequels don't do as well, or they let people down compared to what the original film was. But financially, both of these films have been huge financial successes. In other words, making more than $1 billion each. And this one will probably be ahead of the original Avatar because it hasn't been even released for 1 month as of this podcast recording, and it's already closer to $2 billion. So why do you think that this film or this series has really resonated with audiences? I mean, what's the key to their success?
Yes, these films are absurdly successful. I think the conversation about the highest grossing films is nonsense without adjusting for inflation. But even adjusted for inflation, the first Avatar remains second only to Gone with the Wind for the most successful theatrically released film of all time. If you're just looking at the numbers, there is absolutely no scenario in which the first Avatar, at least, is not seen as an astounding filmmaking accomplishment. Some people will talk about Avengers as having the same kind of cultural footprint for bringing in so much money, but it took nearly 20 films to get to that point. What's so unique about Avatar is that it was a brand new concept when it was first released back in 2009. There were no build-ups, there were no built-in audiences outside of James Cameron fans and fans of the sci-fi genre, and it still brought in more money than anything since the 1990s. There is no comparison to the financial success that was the original Avatar. And there have been papers and seminars given on what it was about that original film that captured people. And looking at the numbers for the new one, The Way of Water, very obviously still captures people. The films are sort of known for their technological brilliance. I think that certainly carries a lot of weight in terms of what makes these movies successful. They are just unlike anything you have ever seen before. They push the technological achievements to the limit. And there's been a ton of publicity, especially surrounding the new one along those lines. And just watching it, it looks very different. I watched it and thought this just feels visually different from what I've seen. And a lot of it had to do with the film being shot at 48 frames per second rather than the standard 24. It's little things like that make it feel very different from what you've seen in the past. But I also think the fact that these films are so bespoke and tailored and handcrafted and are not the products of corporate plate spinning really shows. I think it was the late Roger Ebert who likened watching the first Avatar in theaters to watching the original Star Wars film as a kid. And I think that says a lot. It just shows you the ability of someone like James Cameron to create a very unique and memorable theatrical experience for film goers. And the storyline is predictable, but it's also timeless. It's mythic, even. And I don't use mythic here in the very liberal sense of the word. We've talked about this a million times on here. A myth does not automatically render something as old and irrelevant. C.S. Lewis would refer to the biblical story as being mythic, not in the sense that it is untrue, but in the sense that it works very much as a kind of mythic story. It's very large and vast and sweeping and concerned about the condition of the human heart and relies on very powerful imagery to communicate its ideas. Avatar is very similar to that. It's a huge epic story, and the characters are treated as larger than life, and the emotions are as big and sweeping as the scope of the narrative. Cameron himself even said that he looked to things like Star Wars or The Lord of the Rings as inspiration in fleshing out this world. And people will always turn up for that kind of story, as has been seen time and time again.
I want to ask you a little bit about James Cameron, because is this kind of the culmination of his career? People might or might not remember, unless they're real big film buffs, that James Cameron directed Aliens, and Sigourney Weaver is also, her voice is in this particular sequel, but she was this, that's kind of one of the cinematic sci-fi movies. It's dated now because it came out in the 80s, but still Aliens is very much had this cultural footprint, as well as his Terminator series. And Terminator has also got, big pop culture in the history of pop culture, just quotes from the film and all those kinds of things. And of course, Titanic, that made Leonardo DiCaprio this, worldwide star, and just all the different music from Titanic and everything. So he's had it's not like he's, had only a few successes. He's had some major pop culture imprint type films, and now this Avatar series. So is there something that's a thread through all of them, or he just, how has he put his, I guess, directorial imprint to know the pulse of, people would love Aliens and Terminator and something totally different, Titanic?
Yeah, the one thing I think everyone learns is that you should probably just not bet against James Cameron. It seems like he knocks it out of the park every time he swings, and there's no scenario in which people do not look back on the filmmaking industry and you do not talk about James Cameron in the same breath as people like Steven Spielberg or George Lucas or Francis Ford Coppola or Orson Welles. I mean, he's just one of those guys who has, every time he does something, it sort of is a seismic shift in the industry. It redefines filmmaking for the era that he releases it. Probably my personal favorite series of his is the Terminator series. Even the bad ones are fairly innovative, fairly creative ventures. And I think the one thing you see that is a common thread throughout his filmography is just a creative genius, really, in a lot of ways. Someone who is able to take very powerful imagery. There's sort of the story goes that he wrote the entire Terminator film based off of a dream that he had. in which he saw this metallic skull on fire or something like that. And that becomes like the genesis of the entire Terminator film franchise. So it's stuff like that you hear and read about and think, okay, this guy can do what others can't. He just has a good eye for filmmaking, and he knows to keep his finger on the pulse of the zeitgeist. And I think it really shows every time he comes out with something. I mean, he has Titanic and Avatar, two movies that have made more money than all others combined, really, in a sense. Again, you just learn to never bet against the guy. So I think there's a serious through line of creativity, of uniqueness, of never feeling like Cameron is chasing the pop culture whims of the day. He's more of a trendsetter than anything. And he's very well known in the industry for developing technologies that push the capabilities of filmmaking forward. He's just he's a very interesting man.
But at the same time, I think no one would ever say that, the screenplays themselves, the dialogue and those kinds of things are, high art film. Especially there's a lot of lines folks laugh at in Titanic, for example, and even reviews of this one, The Way of Water, people would be like, oh, it's just this same old kind of story. It's like not ingenious storytelling, but maybe his movie making as a whole creates this experience. Because back in the day, I mean, we could rewatch Aliens now. It seems really campy to us, but back in the day, it was a really kind of scary sci-fi thing that has been this intellectual property that's lived on for, all these years, more than 30 years, 40 years.
Yeah, I mean, you could say the same thing about George Lucas. I mean, no one has ever accused Lucas of writing intelligent dialogue, and at the end of the day, I mean, he made Star Wars, and you would not have Star Wars without George Lucas. It's, the two walk hand in hand, and I felt the same way watching The Way of Water. There were some of the dialogue I thought was absolutely laughable. I could not understand why everyone, under a certain age, kept calling everyone bro. I thought, is this something that we, young 20-year-olds still do, or cuz or something like that? I thought that was very, very funny. It felt like someone wrote this from the outside looking in to youth. It felt like someone who was looking at youthfulness and trying to write about it without really understanding it is exactly what that felt like. And I think there is a sense in which things like dialogue and the quality of it, I don't know, it is very stilted, but at the same time, what you're going for in filmmaking is the marriage of theme and imagery. If you can draw very powerful visuals and you can create a world that people want to invest in and characters that people want to invest in, then they sort of forgive, the cliched dialogue or the weak dialogue, and especially when you're dealing with stories that are so paint by the numbers, like some of the Star Wars stories are, like some of what Cameron does is, then you sort of forgive that because you understand that the dialogue comes with the territory. It comes with the mythic storytelling in a sense. And so I think you're absolutely right. I think that it's sort of like the wildness of the imagination, the creativity overrides the little nitpicks for a lot of people.
A new year is a great time to start something new, like a subscription to the Christian Research Journal, which you can do at our website, equip.org. And in 2023, we plan on the Postmodern Realities podcast to bring you every week very interesting conversations with our authors. We're going to continue diving into cultural apologetics, bringing you ways that you can use the hottest, latest trends and films and television series as a springboard to the gospel, because those are kinds of the things that non-Christian people are consuming. So what does Christian worldview look at some of those things, as well as, of course, theological topics and apologetics and ethics, all of these things designed to equip you in your faith, to help you have discernment about teaching around you that is unbiblical, as well as topics which will help you draw closer to Christ in your walk. And so we hope you will join us on this journey in 2023 through more episodes and conversations on the Postmodern Realities podcast. As always, we ask that you would help us out by partnering with us by simply telling a friend about the podcast or sharing your favorite episodes on social media, giving us a tip if a subscription isn't in your budget right now, which is really easy to do. Just go to quip.org and go to Journal and Postmodern Realities. And of course, as I say every week, the landing page has links to the tip. But also just telling people about us, by giving us a review or rating at Apple Podcasts is just a really good way to get the word out. So we look forward to you joining us for the year ahead and are thankful for your partnership. And we'll continue to bring you all these very thoughtful conversations and online exclusive articles.
So now I want to ask you, like I do when we talk about films and television series, because the biggest question for Christians always is, should I watch this film? Or parents, all the kids are seeing The Way of Water, should my kid go to Avatar with their friends? So is there anything in this film that Christians should be particularly wary of? Because I read a whole bunch of faith-based movie reviews on different, websites that kind of catalog, okay, should Christians go see these films, both from a Protestant perspective. And I also read the Roman Catholic review, and they kind of came to the same conclusion that Avatar is a film that is not good for Christians. It's very dangerous because it promotes pantheism and, it is the worship of nature, and also the God that is kind of in their world is female, those kinds of things. So do you think these films, and do you think The Way of Water is dangerous because it would introduce all this paganism? And basically, I saw a tweet from a former pastor saying that it was satanic. People should stay away from this film.
Well, first, regarding the question of should I see this film or any film, I think there was maybe only 2 or 3 films in history that I would ever answer a yes to that. You actually should see this film. For Christians and just for people in general, I think you always sort of just be thoughtful about what you're going to watch, and at the end of the day, recognize a movie's usually just a movie. There are very few that are actually, sort of demand to be seen. But you often hear this accusation with Cameron's Avatar in particular. And I think we have to be very careful here and use common sense. This accusation that Avatar promotes pantheism or something along those lines. Look, Avatar promotes pantheism as much as The Lord of the Rings promotes polytheism or the existence of divine thought forms with the Valar. These sorts of hot takes are insanely popular in conservative Christian publications, and you see this stuff all the time. For whatever reasons, Christians believe that interacting with a piece of pop culture means often looking for the hidden heresies sprinkled throughout, or going after little details in an attempt to reconstruct an entire philosophy at work in the narrative. The irony being, of course, that these same people are often seminary trained and are the ones teaching the Bible and employing that same kind of hermeneutic to biblical teaching, and that is very frightening to me because it ends up sort of destroying context and an eye for literary hermeneutics. No, I don't think Avatar promotes pantheism any more than C.S. Lewis promotes the idea that Jesus became a lion in another reality. Pantheism is an aspect of the story. It is the religious conviction of the Na'vi on Pandora in the story. There are certain events that characters interpret in the context of that religious conviction. But there are also scientists there coming up with the scientific explanations for what's happening. That is actually a major plot point in the first film. When Sigourney Weaver's character sort of rushes in to try and stop the humans from doing what they're doing, she's trying to explain to them that there's actually a very scientific basis for why the Na'vi think the way they do and have this religious conviction, that there is a kind of ecological explanation for it. In the same way, keeping with the Narnia image, the transmogrification of Jesus into a lion in order to do for another world what he did for ours is an element of the story. It's the engine driving the narrative, but it's not what Lewis is trying to teach, so to speak. It's almost window dressing to the real mechanics of storytelling, which are plot, characters, and dialogue. And I appreciate the zeal of Christians who tackle these pop culture artifacts in this way. I certainly think they have the best interest of the church at heart most of the time. But a lot of times I look at these angles and think, well, you're either seriously overthinking this or you're just missing the obvious point. As far as James Cameron's religious convictions, he himself has claimed to have sworn off agnosticism, which he said back in 2010. He actually said agnosticism is like cowardly atheism. And I sort of like the tension in that statement. I really sort of appreciate his perspective on that. And you can find these statements quite easily online. He is a very scientifically minded individual who has said that he sees very little support for the idea of an afterlife scientifically, but is willing to amend his perspective should that change. If anything, Cameron would be more like the scientists in Avatar who are trying to explain away the seemingly naive pantheistic ideas of the natives. Now, you might get some mileage out of the idea that Avatar is Cameron exploring an angle on pantheism. Sure, you can argue that. But I remember reading years ago a very popular Christian article on that first film that calls it Cameron's great apologia or defense of pantheism. And that really is quite comical to me, considering that the man himself is a fairly open atheist, or at least some kind of weird subspecies of agnostic. That would be like looking at one of the audio dramas I've done and saying he's written this great apologia for medieval superstitions. No, those are elements of the story, but I myself am a happy fundamentalist. So all this to say, I think you can certainly watch the Avatar films and move into conversations about pantheism because there are strains in the story. But to say that these fictional films designed to entertain audiences are promoting pantheism like it's foisting it upon these little impressionable minds, it just strikes me as a little over the top. Again, it's no more foisting it upon the viewer than Lewis foists the idea of a transmogrified Jesus. The converse here would be to say this. If you're going to attack Cameron's Avatar for promoting pantheism, then you should probably stop giving Christians like Lewis and Tolkien a free pass and actually attack that much harder, because these are people in our own camp who are crafting stories that involve, again, divine thought forms and transmogrified Christs. If we want to approach this from the angle of Christian parents, you should always be wary of what your kid is watching or reading. I don't care if it's Star Wars, I don't care if it's Narnia, I don't care if it's Avatar. There's a danger that with Lewis, your kid comes to think of Jesus less as a human being and more as a lion. And doctrinally, you would have a big problem there. There's a chance that watching Avatar, your kid comes away with questions about pantheism or this feminine divinity called Awa in the story. These are opportunities to talk to them about these things. And I don't think you can, perpetually shelter your children from these ideas all their life. I'm more of the camp that they sort of grow up and think, wait a minute, well, there are a lot of things out there that nobody told me about. Why didn't anybody tell me about these things? But there are also very good values in Cameron's films that we affirm as basic humans. The importance of family, for example, though that is rapidly being redefined in this culture, or of coming to value others who are different from us. Those, you can say, are ideas foisted upon us by the narrative, because the plot, characters, and dialogue all affirm those things that are common to the human experience, or mythic even. So ultimately, I would say that there are many worse films to watch than Avatar. If you go to the theater to see it, enjoy the popcorn, enjoy your family, analyze what you're watching with a little bit of common sense, and generally speaking, you'll be okay.
I think there are also some concerns in those Christian reviews of the, because we talked about how the Avatar characters of this, nature societies have kind of this primitive feel to them. So there was a complaint about female nudity because the characters are not that covered. I mean, if you go to some more, not developed societies here in our planet, there are people who don't wear as much as what we would consider modern clothing to be covered. So would that be a concern for people? Because I did read that in some of those reviews.
I mean, I saw the film and nothing really jumped out strikingly at me. I mean, I know you saw it too. Did you notice anything like this? I mean, I can see where the hesitation might come in. And I mean, if the curves bother you, then absolutely don't take your children. But there's nothing off the top of my head that I can think of that jumps out.
No, I would just say that they're not super clothed, but they're, like I was saying, in less developed societies that are living, off the land, that people still are.
Yeah, I mean, there's some people running around in loincloths, but
Yes.
so is Tarzan, and
Right, but
so,
the women, I guess that was the complaint about the women, they were not
okay,
wearing.
well, I will say it this way: there is nothing that I saw that made me think, "Oh, this film includes nudity." If that makes sense. I mean,
Yeah,
yes,
and
they're
also just
scantily
to let
clothed,
people
but
know, it's not a cartoon because they did, kind of blue screen and stuff with real actors, so that we can appreciate that those actors were actually, swimming and things like that. They were underwater. But but it does have that animation type of feel to it, kind of like computer animation type of feel, even though it was, real actors.
yes, you're absolutely right. And for anyone who cares about this sort of thing, it really does feel like a video game at times. The frame rate, the frames per second, it makes it feel like a video game. The way that it's done, and it's very eerie almost to see it on a film. But again, the technology and the advancements made, and the ability to film underwater and stuff like that was all sort of part and parcel to the build up to this film.
Well, I'm going to talk a little bit more about, we kind of given the background of James Cameron and Avatar and just the setting of these films, but I want to talk a little bit more specifically about this film, The Way of Water. And we talked about how it's made a lot of money, but particularly for this film, what's the storyline and who are the major characters? What's happened since film one and film two?
So, The Way of Water picks up some years after the ending of the first film. Jake, at the conclusion of the first film, chooses to remain in his avatar form. He goes through a kind of ritual that transfers his consciousness into his avatar. So now he's living as an avatar, and he is able to start a family with his mate, Neytiri, who's played by Zoe Saldana. And now they have children, Neteyam, Loak, Tukture, and Kiri. And when the movie begins, they are living life, basically, on this alien planet called Pandora. Now, in the previous film, Jake had led the Na'vi against the human colonizers on the planet, and for a time in the aftermath, they have this sort of relative peace. But at the beginning of the new film, the humans return with no small amount of force. And the villain of the first film, Miles Quaritch, played by the wonderfully menacing Stephen Lang, returns as a recombinant avatar who is tasked with hunting down Jake. So, in order to keep his family safe, Jake strikes out with his family to seek refuge with the Na'vi clans living in the islands. So, Jake's clan is primarily forest based, but now they're heading out into the islands and exploring a new and foreign Na'vi culture. Meanwhile, Quaritch and his men are hunting them, and that's really the plot of the new film in a nutshell.
So now we talked a little bit about how Christians see the film as being, promoting pantheism and paganism. But in interviews, James Cameron, when they've asked him about the themes that he wanted to explore in this film, he really talks about the importance of family, which, for Christians and conservatives, seems like that would be a great thing to emphasized in a film, and specifically this one that so many people are seeing. So do you see any kind of dissonance, I guess, between his themes and current, cultural norms about how we view the family? And it's really in this particular film, and including some of the characters that they meet, it's very much of showing the traditional nuclear family, and our culture is kind of going away from showing the traditional nuclear family with a mother and a father and children.
Yeah, I find this so incredibly fascinating. Ultimately, Cameron has been exploring in both of these films, through the protagonist, just what it takes to build and maintain an unconventional but still nuclear family. As a character, Jake struggles with the burdens of fatherhood and being a good mate to Neytiri. And especially as his kids grow up in this film, he struggles to find ways to relate to them. He is very domineering. He is very strict with his sons. And on the flip side, they feel the burden of living in his shadow when he is considered this great leader among the Na'vi people. And these films, in this regard, are actually very relatable. They're very human in that sense. And I do find it so interesting that we are living in a very globalized culture where, at least in the more affluent countries, traditional values like these are being unmoored seemingly on a daily basis. We're living in a day and age where the traditional family unit is being shaken up and reevaluated through the lenses of identity politics and what some might call postmodern thought. And yet many of these same people are throwing money by the billions at a film that is almost obsessed with validating the traditional family unit and the inner workings of that. And there's certainly room for unconventionality in that context because two of Jake's kids are adopted. One of them is not even a Na'vi by the end of this film. But the basic structure of husband and wife and children and trying to instill values in their children, good values, and the children learning to become their own person within that dynamic, that is ultimately what this film is about. There is absolutely no coincidence that the big finale ends with this very touching moment in which this family is together. It's the theme. It's the thing that pulls all the narrative threads together. It's what Jake says at the end of the film, what the family mantra has been throughout it, the whole idea that the Sullys stick together. He said that was their greatest weakness, but also their great strength. The family unit weathers all storms, but at least they do it together. So if we want to make everything a political discussion, I'm kind of curious where all the very conservative articles are on these ideas that run throughout Avatar and Avatar: The Way of Water, because the family unit is front and center. And like you said, listening to Cameron talk, that's what he was wanting to do.
It is interesting regarding the Avatar films. I understand why some of the religious smatterings in there, people are focusing on them as, being very non-Christian and primitive and pantheistic and so forth. But I find in terms of like political themes, what is, kind of heavy-handed maybe in them are some of the issues about environmentalism and colonialism and ecology, especially the idea of the bad guys are military people that we should, be respecting. But here they are, the military of whatever nameless countries, or it's just supposed to be humanity. I mean, they seem like Americans, or maybe they are Americans, but it's just like they represent all of humanity. And some of these issues that they're trying to mine for resources. And in this particular film, it switches from mining the resources to now destroying different kinds of animals for human consumption. And it kind of was, I think, a statement almost to me about whaling. Maybe you can get into that, about how we hunt. I was thinking about that when they were showing this, like, oh, we hunt whales. And did people really realize that the parts of the whales that we're using are for makeup and different things like that, that we're killing them for our own vanity kind of a thing. And that was a little bit of what was said about these particular beings that were similar to whales. So how does the Way of Water, this film, continue the exploration of those kinds of themes, environmentalism, colonialism, etc.?
Yeah, Cameron is very interested in these themes as well. If I remember correctly, just to clarify, the militaristic forces are all privatized in this story. That's sort of the idea, I think, is that everything becomes business driven on Earth, and so they basically hire out these private military contractors to do sort of the dirty work for them. So I don't know if that it's so much humanity as the villain. I think it's these very specific groups, these corporations that employ these sort of mercenaries, for lack of a better word, and send them to Pandora that become the villains here. But anyway, Cameron is very interested in these themes of environmentalism and ecology. Both films feature the dangers of very capitalistically minded businessmen who have no morals other than greed, who are using Pandora as a mining venture for resources. They are effectively destroying the environment of Pandora with no regard for the Na'vi's religious convictions or just how different the ecology of this planet is from the Earth. That was the scene I was referencing from the first film, when the scientists are trying to explain to these individuals that the ecology actually works very differently on Pandora than it does on Earth, that there might actually be a real scientific reason for why the Na'vi are so pantheistic, let's say. And in The Way of Water, these themes are continued. There's a very pronounced analog to the whaling industry in this film. I think you're absolutely right. So when it comes to this particular political discussion, I think you do get a lot of mileage out of it. That being said, I sort of think these ideas are less about Cameron trying to make a film about environmentalism. Again, this is a story, not a documentary. It's more about finding natural and easy inroads that carry audiences into the setting he has established and help them relate to the characters. These are issues not because he's trying to make an environmentalism film, but they are natural and easy ways for the audience to recognize some of the conflicts in that world. You recognize them and you make analogies in your head to things that are going on in the real world, and that's easy to do as a filmmaker. And I think even the most conservative of Christians can look at the current state of things and recognize the need for a conversation about environmentalism on political platforms. You actually can recognize the need for the conversation without automatically becoming woke, so to speak. This is one of the great weaknesses of many modern Christian thinkers. We have allowed ourselves to become so fixated on issues and attacking the opposition that we have allowed our convictions to be eroded. We play the game on the terms of the opposition, and we allow for no nuance anymore. There is a rejection of the Jamesian admonishment of being quick to hear but slow to speak and slow to anger. I can look at the issue of environmentalism, for example, which has a clear analog in Cameron's story, and recognize the significance of that conversation. But I absolutely do not believe that dyeing your hair an absurd color and throwing soup on a Van Gogh painting while wearing a ridiculous t-shirt does much to help the environment other than make you look like an idiot. If you were that concerned about environmentalism, you take out some loans, you get a degree in biochemistry, and then build some nanobots to help clean up oil in the oceans. And that's not some pithy example. I actually know people who do just that, who are actually very conservative Christians. They are strong advocates for environmentalism who take part in the conversation without stepping over into what we might call liberal political agendas and identity politics. These are people who wake up and go to Baptist churches on Sunday mornings. Nuance. It actually is very possible. And Cameron's film certainly provides interesting textures and wrinkles in that conversation.
So I want to ask you about why you think that James Cameron has the, kind of subtitle to this sequel being The Way of Water. And it's a major point in the film, I think, from a philosophical standpoint. It helps to emphasize some of the things that we were just talking about. But what is the way of water in this particular film? And what do you think that James Cameron is trying to communicate by setting this film in water, besides some of the technological advancements that he made in filmmaking? But besides that, what was his point of using that scene and setting for the film?
One of the characters actually explains the way of water, and I had to sort of scramble to get all this together after seeing the film. But the explanation is this is an actual quote from the film. It's, "The way of water has no beginning and no end. The sea around you and in you, the sea is your home before your birth and after your death. Our hearts beat in the womb of the world. Our breath burns in the shadows of the deep. The sea gives and the sea takes. Water connects all things, life to death, darkness to light." So the idea here is that water becomes a kind of metaphor for the interconnectedness of all things, which again, in this world that Cameron has built, there is a very strong ecological reason for that. But it sounds very much like the circle of life in The Lion King, the notion that there is a kind of natural order in which we all participate. And again, this philosophy is very key to the Na'vi of the islands. And remember, the religious convictions of these natives are something very much like pantheism. I mean, our hearts beat in the womb of the world. That's a pretty pantheistic idea there. This recurring theme goes throughout the film, and it becomes a way narratively for the characters to find strength in their religious convictions. It helps them heal even when they lose someone close to them. The idea that, as Jake says at one point, all energy is borrowed, and at some point you have to give it back. It helps the characters frame the tragedies of life within a larger picture. Now, what's fascinating here is that Cameron is, again, a kind of avowed atheist, or at least an atheistic-leaning agnostic. So as mentioned earlier, I think what you see here is a storyteller who is exploring a kind of potential afterlife. This is not some impassioned defense of pantheism, but I think it's Cameron exploring the possibility of what an afterlife might look like in the context of the world he has created. Especially when there's a sort of ecological reason that is underpinning these beliefs. And what I mean when I say that, I want to be very careful that I'm not misheard. But again, if you watch the first film, there is a scene where Sigourney Weaver's character is trying to plead, I think it's with Giovanni Ribisi's character, who is sort of like the corporate mastermind in the first film, where she's trying to explain to him that the Na'vi are not pantheistic because they don't understand things, but there might actually be something in the planet itself that they have scientific evidence for that validates in this context why they think the way they think about their planet. So it's sort of interesting to me that Cameron seems to be exploring the possibility of an afterlife in the context of the world he's made. And the fact that he is willing to lean into and recognize the need for religious conviction in his fictional setting is actually quite good. He recognizes that even the Na'vi must have a way of explaining the basic elements of existence, life, death, the world around them. And I would say, we could panic if the entire film revolved around the inability to know anything at all about religious conviction, or that there is no afterlife. Then I would say we have someone with an axe to grind through a piece of pop culture. But the authorial intent here goes a long way, and I think you have to work with the narrative in its own context to get that.
So at the very end of the film, there's this interesting wrinkle, I guess, that incorporates very specific ideas about history, what to do with the past, and the role that, fear plays in overshadowing like hard choices. So why do you think this is a theme that our culture is really fixated on right now? I mean, we saw some of the same things about The Last Jedi and during that film. I know you didn't review it for us, but it was, in that film. And so it seems like a lot of big films right now are focused on this idea of reckoning with history, dealing with that. How does The Way of Water kind of fit into that?
Yeah, so there's a through line throughout The Way of Water, which is sort of coming to grips with the past. In a sense, the past returns in a lot of ways. Quaritch comes back as the villain, but differently. The humans return, but differently. That idea runs throughout the narrative, and Jake at the very end sort of has to come to grips with how he has let fear in trying to keep his family together. He's been driven and motivated by fear throughout the story, and that's not necessarily a good thing. But as far as the reckoning with the past goes, I think American filmmakers recognize that Western culture is at a point where we are sort of reckoning with the past. And you see this in the themes and the ideas in these sort of big films. I mean, there are a lot of films right now that big films right now that deal with things like colonialism, that deal with issues of race and ethnicity, I guess is the more scientifically viable term there, ethnicity. I mean, this is sort of the great existential crisis of right now. We are at a point in time where we are literally tearing down statues of individuals who left a cultural footprint in America, for example, and not commenting one way or the other on the validity of that. But maybe the question should be why we felt the need to put those statues up in the first place. The point is, we are a culture reckoning with the past on a daily basis. So it does not surprise me that pop culture artifacts that this culture is currently producing reflect that. Looking back on some of these films in 100 years, films like The Batman, films like The Way of Water, films like the first Avatar, looking back on these films in 100 years, people are going to see, I think, a fairly accurate reflection of the things that haunt us as a collective.
Well, that's been a very interesting conversation about this new hot film. And so we, again, encourage Christians to have discernment, figure out what it's about for yourself. Also, just look into it and see if it's a film for you. But, I honestly have to say is I went in with very, very low expectations, thinking it would be a slog. And yes, the dialogue was cheesy in spots, but I was surprised at how much it was just like a popcorn movie, kind of one of those, blockbuster movies. And the characters were engaging. And I'd have to say the special effects were just really well done. I saw it in 3D and it was a great experience. And I thought I'd be looking at the clock and just wondering how much longer, but I didn't really. I just went along for the ride.
And it is, I agree. I think the time passed quickly, which is key when you recognize that this film is it 3 hours and 12 minutes? This is an absurdly long film, but it certainly doesn't feel that way. Everyone in my screening was sort of glued to the seat, and I saw this in a Dolby theater, so it was quite good.
Well, finally, I have a fun rapid fire question for Cole. So, Cole, it's still January, and I'm asking our authors if they make any New Year's resolutions. But more than that, that's just a yes or no question. I'm asking authors to give me a word that they'd like to describe what they hope for in 2023.
Vacation.
Vacation. That's a good one.
Vacation. Yeah.
Well, Cole, it's been good to have you on the Postmodern Realities podcast again.
It's always good to be here. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to episode 324 of the Postmodern Realities podcast and our discussion of the film Avatar, The Way of Water. My guest today was Cole Burgett, who has written an exclusive film review for the Christian Research Journal. His film review is called The Way of Family in Avatar, The Way of Water, and our subscribers can read it for free at our website, equip.org.
Stay connected with the Christian Research Institute and all the new content we have coming your way. The best way to do that is to head on over to our website, equip.org. There you will find thousands of free resources right at your fingertips, from articles to video to audio, and it's all for free. You'll find our podcasts hosted there, as well as the Bible Answer Man broadcast, which is hosted by CRI President Hank Hanegraaff and streams live every Monday through Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern. In addition, you don't want to miss out on subscribing to Hank Unplugged, which is the podcast of Hank Hanegraaff. And in that podcast, he has really in-depth, free-flowing, essential Christian conversations with some of the most interesting, informative, and inspirational people. And in addition, he has a new series on his podcast feed called Hank Unplugged Shorts, which Hank goes into the headlines in the mainstream media and refutes a lot of those cultural issues that we have in these short podcast episodes. And there's quite a few of them. You don't want to miss out on them. Now, if you want to find some of this at other places where it's all in one place, really subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a great way to get all of our content there, our podcasts there, and different individual questions theologically that people have that Hank answers at our YouTube channel. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, I don't know how to subscribe to YouTube. I don't have a YouTube account. Well, actually, you might just have a YouTube account. If you have a Gmail address, you have a YouTube account. Just log into YouTube with your Gmail address and search for Bible Answer Man channel, and please become one of our subscribers. In addition, if you see that bell icon right there on our front page, please click that, and every time that we have new content, you will receive a notification that new content is up on our channel for you to be able to consume. So thank you so much for the ways in which you partner with the Christian Research Institute. We are grateful for you listening and reading and watching.